What if the pages of history were redacted not with ink, but with silence? In every nation's story, there are shadows, absences where stories should live. Some are simply forgotten, others are deliberately buried. Ours is no different. For more than a century, events that shook the very foundations of American democracy, morality, and identity were hidden beneath official denials and quiet deletions. They weren't myths or rumors. They were documented realities, often confirmed by the very institutions that once denied them. Consider this. What if powerful forces plotted to overthrow the U.S. government and install a dictatorship, and nearly succeeded? What if military leaders once proposed staging terrorist attacks on American soil to provoke war? What if school children were poisoned, not by accident, but by design? These aren't questions drawn from speculative fiction. They're pieces of a historical record that was nearly lost, or more accurately, stolen. What unites these moments isn't merely their horror, but their invisibility. Whole massacres erased from textbooks, government operations conducted in secret, then scrubbed from memory, files locked away for decades until time softened the shock. But time, we're learning, doesn't erase truth. It only delays its arrival. In this series, we'll travel through 14 interwoven stories, each a chapter in the secret history of America. Not conspiracy theories, but confirmed, documented events that were intentionally hidden from public view. We'll follow the trails of classified files, survivor testimony, and long-buried reports. And we'll ask the deeper question: how did we come to accept such selective memory? Some of what we'll uncover will challenge what we thought we knew about war, about power, about justice. Other parts may confirm long-held suspicions, but at its heart, this isn't a story about lies. It's a story about forgetting and what it costs us. History isn't simply what happened. It's what we choose to remember. And if that memory is curated, carefully edited by those in power, then what does it say about the stories we tell ourselves? We begin not with a whisper, but a silence so deep it once swallowed a coup d'etat. A silence crafted not by ignorance, but by design. This is the story of what was meant to be forgotten and what refused to stay buried. It was 1933. The nation was on its knees. The Great Depression had gutted the American economy. Bread lines stretched down city blocks. Banks had collapsed. The air was thick with fear, hunger, and despair. But in the boardrooms of America's most powerful corporations, a very different kind of fear was brewing: the fear of losing control. Franklin D. Roosevelt had just taken office. His New Deal promised sweeping reforms, banking regulations, public works, protections for labor. To millions, it was salvation. But to a small cadre of industrialists and financiers, it was something far more dangerous, a threat to the old order, to profits, and to power. So, they hatched a plan. The goal was simple, if chilling: overthrow the President of the United States and install a fascist regime. Not a theory, not speculation. A real documented conspiracy, planned by men at the heart of American industry. They needed a leader, someone beloved, respected, and capable of commanding an army. They chose Smedley Butler, a retired Marine general and one of the most decorated soldiers in American history. His loyalty among veterans was unmatched. If anyone could lead 500,000 disillusioned soldiers in a march on Washington, it was him. But they misjudged the man. Butler listened. He let them speak. He collected names, bank records, and secret proposals. And then he did something extraordinary. He turned them in. In 1934, he testified before Congress, revealing every detail of the planned coup. He described meetings, documents, and the offer of millions in funding. A bond salesman turned messenger had even shown him bank accounts with hundreds of millions in backing. The evidence was clear. The danger was real. The plot had nearly moved into action. Congress acknowledged it. The House Un-American Activities Committee confirmed Butler's account in its final report. The words were unambiguous. Certain persons had made an attempt to establish a fascist organization in this country. And then, nothing. No arrests, no trials. The report was quietly buried. Newspapers, many owned by the very men implicated, downplayed or ignored the story. The general's warnings faded from headlines. The conspirators returned to their boardrooms. The coup that almost was vanished into the footnotes of history. For decades, historians dismissed Butler's claims as exaggeration. Only in the 1970s, when suppressed documents were quietly declassified, did the full scope of the plot come into view. By then, most of the conspirators were dead. Justice would never arrive. And yet, the silence endured. Today, few remember the day democracy was nearly undone, not by foreign enemies, but by American elites. Few learn about the general who stopped a fascist uprising with nothing but integrity and a sworn oath. What does it mean that such a story could be erased? And if the past can be rewritten so easily, if truth can be buried beneath the weight of wealth and influence, how secure is any democracy? This wasn't a story of radicals. It was a story of patriots betrayed by profit. It happened once. Could it happen again? The year was 1962, and the Cold War was at a boil. Cuba, freshly aligned with the Soviet Union, loomed just 90 miles from Florida's shores. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion still stung. Washington was desperate to reverse the tides, and some at the highest levels were willing to go to terrifying lengths. Inside the Pentagon, a plan was born. It was called Operation Northwoods. Drafted by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the most senior military leaders in the United States, it outlined a chilling strategy. Commit acts of terror on American soil, blame Cuba, and use the outrage to justify war. The proposals were methodical, calculated, and deeply disturbing. Sink a boat of Cuban refugees, real or faked. Blow up U.S. ships in harbors. Stage bombings in American cities. Hijack civilian airplanes. Kill innocent Americans, all orchestrated, then blamed on Fidel Castro. One suggestion was especially grotesque. Fake the downing of a chartered airliner filled with college students. The details were coldly precise. False wreckage, mourning families, outraged headlines. The goal? A helpful wave of indignation that would rally the nation to war. President John F. Kennedy saw the proposal and rejected it immediately. Reportedly appalled, he began the process of removing the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the very man who had shepherded the plan. For decades, the operation remained classified, just another ghost in a sealed file cabinet. Then, in 1997, a researcher uncovered the declassified documents through a Freedom of Information Act request. What emerged was not conspiracy, but confirmation. America's top generals had drawn up plans to murder American citizens in cold blood, not for defense, but for deception. Operation Northwoods was never executed, but its very existence asks a harrowing question. How close did we come? How fragile is the line between national security and national manipulation? Some say it was just one plan among many, a relic of Cold War desperation. But the language in those pages, dry, procedural, bureaucratic, speaks to something more unsettling. A willingness to manufacture consent through carnage, to trade lives for leverage, truth for power. And once you know that, you can't unknow it. The people who wrote those proposals wore uniforms of honor. They took oaths to protect the nation. Yet their plan relied on the nation's own pain. If the president had said yes, if just one more signature had been scrawled on the bottom of that page, what history might we be living now? This isn't just a story of a plan that failed. It's a glimpse into a system where loyalty can bend, where secrecy protects not just operations, but intentions. And the documents remained hidden for 35 years. What else lies waiting in locked drawers? It began with a single false accusation and ended with a city in flames. May 31st, 1921, Tulsa, Oklahoma. In the Greenwood district, something remarkable had taken root. An entire community built by Black Americans had flourished against all odds. Banks, hotels, newspapers, theaters, Black-owned, Black-operated, and successful. So successful, in fact, that white newspapers dubbed it Black Wall Street. It was not merely wealth that thrived there, it was dignity, autonomy, a blueprint for what freedom could look like after centuries of chains. But prosperity has always been a dangerous thing when it threatens the wrong people. That spring, a young Black man was accused of assaulting a white woman in an elevator. There was no evidence, just a whisper turned wildfire. A lynch mob gathered. But Black World War I veterans determined to protect their own arrived at the courthouse, armed and resolute. Tensions erupted, shots were fired, and then came the fury. Over the next 24 hours, an orchestrated mob of white residents, policías, deputized by city officials and armed with weapons from National Guard armories, descended on Greenwood. They didn't just riot, they invaded. Witnesses reported private planes dropping firebombs from above, one of the first aerial assaults on American civilians. Machine gun fire tore through homes. Street by street, Greenwood was burned to ash. 35 blocks destroyed. 10,000 residents left homeless. As many as 300 dead. But that wasn't the end. Survivors weren't helped. They were arrested, herded into internment camps watched by armed guards. Insurance companies refused claims. The city passed new laws to prevent rebuilding. And then, as if wiping soot from a ledger, the cover-up began. Local newspapers were altered, pages literally cut from bound volumes. Police files vanished. Death certificates were never issued. Survivors were threatened into silence. And for nearly 80 years, Greenwood disappeared from American memory. It wasn't until 1996 that a formal investigation was launched. Only then did ground-penetrating radar reveal what oral histories had long whispered, the presence of mass graves. The massacre didn't appear in Oklahoma textbooks until 2009. Most Americans didn't hear about it until a fictional TV show forced the truth back into the light. What does it say about a nation that hides the destruction of its own communities? That buries its dead not just in earth, but in silence? Greenwood was more than a neighborhood. It was proof that a people, long denied everything, could rise and build beauty from pain. And that is precisely what made it dangerous. We remember the flames now, but for decades we remembered nothing at all. History, when left in the hands of power, forgets what it fears. It turns justice into myth, and silence into policy. But ashes don't lie forever. Eventually, even the earth speaks. It sounds like fiction. It wasn't. For over 2 decades, beginning in the early 1950s, the Central Intelligence Agency carried out secret experiments on unwitting citizens. Not in some enemy state, but here, on American soil. They called it MK Ultra. At its heart, the goal was control. The Cold War had ignited a new kind of fear, not just of bombs, but of minds. Could a person be programmed? Could memory be erased, rewritten? Could an assassin be created who didn't even know they were one? The methods were brutal. LSD was administered to patients without consent. Torture was used to induce amnesia. Electroshock therapy, sometimes 40 times more intense than clinical standards, erased identities. In one Canadian hospital, patients were kept in drug-induced sleep for weeks, subjected to recorded messages for hours a day, and emerged with no memory of who they were. They had come in for anxiety. They left unable to speak. Prisoners, sex workers, the mentally ill, anyone considered expendable was used. Some didn't even know they'd been part of an experiment until decades later. In San Francisco and New York, the CIA operated brothels where patrons were secretly dosed with psychoactive drugs while agents watched behind two-way mirrors. The data wasn't gathered to help. It was observed like theater. The agency destroyed most records in 1973. What we know now: the subprojects, the victims, the scope, survived only because of misfiled documents found years later during a budget audit. Congressional hearings in 1975 exposed fragments of the truth, but by then the narrative was already being softened. It was a different time, they said. We've stopped now. But had they? Declassified documents from the 80s and 90s show similar research under new code names. Bioethics commissions in the 2000s confirmed that unethical testing, radiation, chemical exposure, neurological experiments continued into the 21st century, often on soldiers and the vulnerable. The public was told it ended. The evidence suggests otherwise. Why does this matter? Because the line in between research and violation, between medicine and manipulation, was crossed. And kept crossing. Because people trusted doctors and were harmed by governments. Because forgetting allows repetition. Most of all, because those who suffered were never truly acknowledged. They weren't spies. They weren't enemies. They were citizens. And their memories, the ones left intact, tell a story not of science, but of betrayal. In a nation built on liberty, the search for control became its own kind of tyranny. And if those files hadn't been misplaced, if those whistleblowers hadn't spoken, would we know anything at all? How many other files were destroyed before anyone noticed? How many names disappeared with the ink? It was supposed to be the land of the free, but freedom has always had conditions. Between 1956 and 1971, the FBI waged a covert war against its own citizens. Not against criminals or foreign agents, but against those who dared to organize, protest, or dream of a different America. The program was called COINTELPRO, Counterintelligence Program, and its mission was chilling in its simplicity: to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize any group the Bureau deemed subversive. The targets? Civil rights leaders, anti-war activists, indigenous organizers, feminists, journalists, religious figures, the very voices that dared to challenge the status quo. What began as surveillance quickly turned to sabotage. Agents infiltrated peaceful movements. They forged letters to sow distrust, encouraged violence to justify arrests, and used psychological warfare to drive people to despair, and sometimes to suicide. One operation involved an anonymous letter urging a prominent civil rights leader to take his own life. The letter was sent just days before he was to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. Accompanying it was a tape, recorded without consent, intended to shame and silence. It didn't stop there. Against the Black Panther Party, the tactics were even more ruthless. The FBI sent fake letters accusing members of being informants, sparking deadly confrontations. In Chicago, agents provided police with a floor plan of a leader's apartment, drugged his drink, and orchestrated a raid that left him shot in his bed while he slept. It wasn't policing. It was political warfare. The truth didn't emerge by design. In 1971, a group of activists broke into an FBI office in Pennsylvania and stole classified files. Inside, they found the blueprint for COINTELPRO. Thousands of pages documenting years of illegal surveillance, disruption, and character assassination. The government's response? At first, denial, then reluctant admission, then the refrain. It ended in 1971. But the documents tell a different story. In the decades that followed, new programs emerged, under new names. Infiltration of activist groups continued. After 9/11, the same playbook was used against environmentalists, anti-war demonstrators, even librarians who questioned surveillance laws. The tactics evolved. The mission endured. No FBI agent was prosecuted. No victim received justice. The agency maintained that these were excesses, not policy. But the paper trail, methodical and deliberate, says otherwise. Why does this matter now? Because democracy isn't just about voting. It's about voice. And when a government targets those who speak, especially those who speak truth to power, it ceases to protect freedom and begins to police thought. COINTELPRO didn't just disrupt movements. It stole momentum from a generation. It fractured communities. It replaced trust with fear. And it left behind a question still echoing today. If dissent can be criminalized, who gets to decide what patriotism looks like? In the mirror of history, COINTELPRO shows us not the failure of a few rogue agents, but the capacity of institutions to turn on their own people, and the cost of silence when they do. Sometimes the truth hides not in whispers, but in records, sealed, stamped, and forgotten. Between 1946 and 1948, in the shadows of World War II and the Nuremberg trials, U.S. government researchers carried out one of the most horrifying medical experiments in modern history. The victims? Nearly 1,500 Guatemalan citizens. Prisoners, soldiers, and the mentally ill infected with syphilis and gonorrhea without their knowledge or consent. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't an isolated incident. It was a deliberate act of medical violence, sanctioned at the highest levels. Led by a U.S. Public Health Service physician, the same man who oversaw the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study, the program was designed to study how sexually transmitted infections spread. But when natural infection proved too slow, researchers took matters into their own hands. Sex workers, themselves infected, were paid to sleep with prisoners. When that failed to produce enough cases, doctors began directly injecting syphilis into arms, spines, and open wounds. In the most brutal phase, mental patients were subjected to repeated exposures. They were never told why. There was no intent to treat the infected. The suffering was the data. At least 83 people died. Likely more. The timing is chilling. These experiments began just months after the world had put Nazi doctors on trial for crimes against humanity. As international ethics codes were being drafted, American doctors were violating every principle they would soon claim to champion. And for over 6 decades, the truth was buried. The Guatemalan government was never informed. Research papers published from the data never revealed how it had been collected. Files were hidden, classified, forgotten. Until 2005, when a professor stumbled across archived documents while researching the earlier Tuskegee study. What she found shocked even seasoned historians. Photographs of infected subjects, correspondence between researchers, detailed logs of procedures, all confirming what had been done. The story became public in 2010. The U.S. issued an apology, but apologies, absent accountability, ring hollow. No one was prosecuted. No institution faced consequences. Survivors and their families received no compensation. When Guatemala filed suit, a U.S. court dismissed the case, citing sovereign immunity. The message was clear. What was done in the name of science would not be judged by the laws of justice. Why tell this story? Because it reveals the ease with which humanity is stripped away when power meets secrecy. Because it shows how ethics, when inconvenient, can be cast aside with a signature, and because it reminds us that the victims of history are often the voiceless, the poor, the forgotten, the expendable. Science without conscience becomes a weapon. And when governments hide that weapon behind classification stamps and diplomatic silence, truth becomes the final casualty. Some wounds don't heal. They don't get closure. They don't get justice. They just get hidden until someone dares to look behind the curtain and read what was never meant to be seen. April 4, 1968. Memphis, Tennessee. A single gunshot echoed across the balcony of the Lorraine Motel, silencing one of the most powerful voices for justice the world has ever known. The assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stunned the world. Officially, the case was closed. A lone gunman, a career criminal, had pulled the trigger. Case solved. But what if it wasn't? What if the truth, long buried under layers of bureaucracy and silence, points to something far more orchestrated? The FBI's hatred of King was no secret. Internally, they had branded him the most dangerous man in America. They bugged his hotel rooms. They tracked his every move. They sent blackmail letters urging him to take his own life. But in 1967, as King began to speak out against the Vietnam War and organize a massive Poor People's Campaign, something shifted. The surveillance turned surgical. The rhetoric turned lethal. Then came Memphis. In the weeks surrounding his death, strange details emerged and were quickly dismissed. Multiple witnesses reported unusual government presence in the city. A local restaurant owner whose building sat beneath the alleged sniper's perch later confessed on national television he'd been paid to help set the stage. He named names. He described a setup. He said the real shooter was a police officer. In 1999, over 3 decades after the assassination, a civil court convened to hear the evidence. After 6 weeks of testimony from 70 witnesses, the jury reached a verdict. There had been a conspiracy. Government agencies were found liable in the death of Dr. King. But few remember this trial. It was barely covered. The evidence was complex. Ballistics were inconclusive. Witnesses described hearing gunfire from directions that didn't match the official story. Intelligence files were destroyed. The FBI claimed they had no agents in Memphis that day, a claim contradicted by local testimonies. The man convicted of the murder, James Earl Ray, pleaded guilty but almost immediately recanted. He maintained until his death that he was set up, a pawn in a game he never understood. Polygraph tests supported his claim. Even King's family publicly stated they believed he was innocent. Still, no broader investigation followed. The case remains closed. What does it mean when a government investigates itself and then silences the results? What does justice look like when it's filtered through politics, fear, and convenience? King's death wasn't just the loss of a leader. It was a rupture in the moral arc of the nation. His vision of peace, of equality, of economic dignity threatened entrenched systems. And those systems, history suggests, responded. The evidence may never yield a single smoking gun, but the pattern is clear. A man watched, harassed, and sabotaged by his own government was then assassinated, and those with the power to uncover the full truth chose not to. When truth is inconvenient, it's not erased, it's buried, beneath redactions, beneath denials, beneath the noise of easier stories. But silence cannot erase consequence, and memory, once awakened, doesn't forget so easily. The image is almost too disturbing to believe. A child, unaware, eating a spoonful of oatmeal laced with radioactive material. A pregnant woman sipping what she believes is a vitamin drink, never told it contains radioactive iron. A prisoner paid a pittance to let scientists expose his testicles to radiation. It sounds dystopian, but it was real. It was American science, sanctioned by government institutions, hidden behind the walls of national security. Between 1944 and 1974, the U.S. government conducted over 4,000 radiation experiments on its own citizens. Few knew. Fewer consented. Most never even suspected. The goal? Understand radiation's effects on the human body, data deemed essential during the nuclear arms race. But rather than rely on accident reports or animal models, researchers chose a more direct method: expose people. At one Ivy League university, over 800 pregnant women were given drinks containing radioactive iron. The effects on their unborn children were quietly recorded. At a Massachusetts state school, mentally disabled boys were fed radioactive cereal as part of a science club. their parents tricked into signing consent forms that mentioned nothing about radiation. In hospitals, patients with terminal illnesses were injected with plutonium without their knowledge. They were told it was treatment. It was data collection. In prisons, men were paid to endure testicular radiation, part of a study on potential sterilization programs. Years later, many developed cancer. Few were informed of the risks. These weren't rogue scientists operating in secrecy. These were publicly funded programs approved by military leaders, university boards, and federal agencies. Memos show officials knew disclosure would spark outrage and recommended keeping the experiments classified indefinitely. And so they were. For decades, the truth remained sealed. Medical journals published findings, but never mentioned the source of the data. Consent forms vanished. Names were changed or redacted. Survivors were never told. It wasn't until the 1990s that the full scope began to surface. A government investigation declassified thousands of documents, revealing a systematic pattern. Choose vulnerable subjects, limit disclosure, bury the results. In 1995, a presidential advisory committee confirmed what many had feared. These weren't isolated errors. They were the product of deliberate choices to sacrifice ethics for expedience. Some victims received apologies. A few received settlements. But many never saw justice. Many never even knew they were victims. And the institutions, the hospitals, the universities, the defense agencies, faced no meaningful consequences. What makes these experiments so haunting isn't just the suffering they caused, it's the context. They occurred during the same era when American prosecutors were condemning similar acts as war crimes in Europe. The same government that demanded accountability abroad was violating the same principles at home. It forces a reckoning. How thin is the veneer of ethics when power goes unchecked? What happens when science, stripped of humanity, becomes another tool of the state? And what is the price? In trust, in life, in legacy. When citizens are turned into test subjects and their pain becomes classified information. Some truths don't need embellishment. They need daylight. They called it a war for liberation. But in the jungles and villages of the Philippines, between 1899 and 1902, American forces waged a campaign that bore little resemblance to freedom. What unfolded was not a tidy post-war occupation. It was a brutal colonial conquest, and for over a century, its full scale was kept out of the American memory. The Philippine-American War began when the United States, having ousted Spain, refused to recognize the Philippines' Declaration of Independence. Former allies were recast as enemies. The war that followed killed hundreds of thousands, most of them civilians. Official textbooks later called it a pacification campaign. But the stories told by soldiers, letters home, and forgotten military reports tell another tale. Entire villages were razed. One general infamously ordered his troops to turn an island into a howling wilderness, commanding them to kill anyone over the age of 10. His logic: children would grow into resistance. Water torture became routine. Known later as waterboarding, it involved forcing water down a prisoner's throat until their stomach distended, then beating it out of them, over and over, until they talked or died. Reconcentration camps, early models of what would become known as concentration camps, were set up to isolate civilians from insurgents. Conditions were horrific, overcrowded, diseased, starving. Many did not survive. American soldiers wrote home about the horror. Some bragged. Others broke. One wrote, "We make everyone get into his house, and then we set fire to every house in sight." Another described executing wounded prisoners. These weren't isolated incidents. They were policy. Back home, reports began to leak. Journalists investigated. Public outcry swelled. Congressional hearings were held. But consequences were rare. A handful of officers were tried. Sentences were light, and often overturned. The general who ordered mass executions was allowed to retire with full honors. Then came the rewrite. Textbooks softened the language. The death toll, estimated as high as 1 million, was dramatically underreported. The atrocities vanished. The war became a footnote, a necessary step in spreading democracy. The truth was buried. It was too inconvenient, too ugly, too damning. But in the Philippines, memory endured. The war is still taught. The names of the dead are remembered. And the legacy of lost sovereignty, of generational trauma, remains. What does it mean that one nation's liberation is another's subjugation? That the same tactics condemned in others were refined under our own flag? And what does it say that so few Americans even know this war occurred? History often flatters its authors, and when those authors are victors, the chapters written in blood are the easiest to omit. But silence does not erase suffering. It only ensures that the same mistakes are made again, this time with cleaner language, better press, and just enough distance to pretend we don't recognize the script. It began with pancakes and orange juice in the early mornings of 1969 across cities like Oakland, Chicago, and New York. Volunteers rose before dawn to prepare hot breakfasts for children. No paperwork, no requirements, just food, free, nutritious, and served with dignity. The program was launched by a revolutionary group that understood something fundamental, that hunger is political and feeding children is an act of empowerment. It was called the Free Breakfast for Children program, and it terrified the FBI. By the end of that first year, the program was feeding over 20,000 children daily in more than 40 cities. Churches opened their doors. Parents found relief. Teachers reported students were more focused. Even mainstream media acknowledged its success. But to the Bureau, this was not a social service. It was a threat. Internal FBI memos declared the breakfast program the greatest threat to internal security. Not because of violence, but because it worked. It built trust. It showed that grassroots movements could solve problems the state had ignored. So the Bureau launched a campaign, not against crime, but against breakfast. Declassified documents reveal the tactics, anonymous letters sent to pastors warning them not to host breakfast sites, false health code violations used to shut down kitchens, coordinated police raids conducted while children were eating, food destroyed, volunteers arrested. In Baltimore, food was poisoned. In San Francisco, suppliers were intimidated. In Chicago, a raid was timed for maximum trauma. Children screamed as armed officers burst in during breakfast. Even parents weren't spared. FBI agents visited homes of participating families, asking if they supported radicals, hinting at investigations, leaving fear behind. The sabotage worked. Churches withdrew. Donations dried up. Volunteers were exhausted, arrested, harassed. One by one, breakfast sites closed. The goal was never justice. It was disruption. And while the headlines focused on the FBI's war against militant leadership, the war against free meals flew under the radar. The Bureau fed no one, but made sure fewer children ate. Why would a government agency go to such lengths to destroy a breakfast program? Because feeding children isn't just charity. It's power. It's narrative. It says, we see you, we value you, we will take care of our own. To the state, that was intolerable. In 1975, the federal government created its own school breakfast initiative, modeled directly on the program it once worked to crush. But the legacy is bittersweet. By then, the original program had been dismantled. Its pioneers had been jailed, discredited, or killed. And the children? They were left to make sense of a world where feeding them had become an act of subversion. Sometimes, history is shaped not by wars or elections, but by something as simple as a plate of food. And the forces that oppose compassion often reveal more about power than any policy ever could. In the end, the story isn't just about breakfast. It's about who gets to nurture, who gets to lead, Who gets to define what care looks like and what systems will do to stop them? In the corridors of the Pentagon, silence is policy. But once, the silence cracked. It was 1997 when a Freedom of Information Act request unearthed a trove of documents. Inside, a blueprint for staged terror. A plan approved by the highest-ranking officers in the U.S. military. The goal? To provoke war by faking tragedy. The plan was called Operation Northwoods, and while it had already been covered earlier in our story, its haunting logic echoes through time and into other, lesser-known operations. Because once deception becomes a tool of policy, the temptation to use it again and again is never far away. Throughout the Cold War and beyond, manipulation of public perception became a quiet craft. Black propaganda, false flag attacks, media influence campaigns. Governments around the world, including our own, flirted with the line between influence and manipulation. In 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident drew the United States into full-scale war in Vietnam. We were told U.S. ships were attacked. Years later, declassified reports revealed that the second attack never happened. It was an illusion, a justification. In the 1980s, covert operations funded foreign insurgencies, sometimes against democratically elected governments. The American public was rarely informed, until scandal, not conscience, forced the truth out. And always the refrain, it was for national security. But at what cost? Trust is a fragile thing. And when a nation's story becomes a tapestry of half-truths and omissions, cynicism takes root. Not just in politics, but in the public soul. These aren't isolated scandals, they're symptoms. Symptoms of a deeper problem, one where secrecy isn't used to protect citizens, but to protect narratives. Where truth becomes elastic. Where history is curated, not recorded. We are not the first nation to walk this path, nor will we be the last. But what sets us apart, or should, is the willingness to confront it. To ask the uncomfortable questions. Why were these operations considered viable in the first place? What assumptions about the public, about us, made deception the preferred path? And perhaps more hauntingly, what operations succeeded so completely that we still don't know they happened? When the past is redacted, so is the future. We inherit not just lies, but the consequences of lies. Wars, policies, attitudes, all shaped by stories that may never have been true. Truth does not always come with headlines or apologies. Sometimes it arrives decades later, in dusty files or whispered testimonies. And sometimes it never arrives at all. In the shadow of each uncovered operation is a larger question. If this was hidden, what else still sleeps beneath the surface? And who decides what we're allowed to remember? There's a pattern to forgetting. It begins not with lies, but with silence. With missing pages, missing lessons, missing voices. With a decision, conscious or not, that some truths are too inconvenient to remember. Across generations, we've seen this erasure at work. From Tulsa to Guatemala, from secret experiments to suppressed investigations, the common thread isn't just what happened. It's how carefully it was hidden. Each time a process unfolds, first, denial. It didn't happen. Then dismissal. It wasn't that bad. Then delay. It's too late to do anything now. And finally, deflection. Let's move on. By the time truth surfaces, if it ever does, the trail is cold, the witnesses are gone, the urgency has faded. And the systems responsible have long since adapted, evolved, rebranded. But the cost of forgetting is never zero. It lives in the architecture of our institutions, in the generational wounds that never received names, in the deep, unspoken mistrust between the governed and those who claim to govern in their name. Consider the cumulative weight of what we've explored. A plot to install a fascist regime erased from textbooks. Government-sanctioned terror plots against its own citizens. massacres reframed as riots, then removed altogether, experiments on the poor, the sick, and the voiceless justified by science, surveillance programs designed to crush dissent, not crime, food programs for children sabotaged in the name of control. Each one isolated is horrifying. Together they form a quiet narrative of power, its uses, its fears, and its capacity to hide its own tracks. So what do we do with that? How do we move forward in a world where the past has been so carefully curated? We remember, not as an act of vengeance, but as an act of clarity, of grounding, of rehumanizing those written out of the story. Because memory is resistance. Every document uncovered, every testimony recorded, every whisper brought into the light is a refusal to let someone else define what matters. And memory, unlike silence, asks something of us. It doesn't just inform, it obligates. To question the official version, to seek the footnotes, to notice who's missing from the photograph. The goal is not to drown in guilt or suspicion. It's to become literate in power, to understand how easily history can be edited and how often it is. Truth is not fragile, but it is perishable. Unless we carry it, unless we speak it, unless we teach it, even and especially when it hurts. In the end, memory is not just about the past. It's the soil from which the future grows. And the more honest that soil, the stronger what comes next can be. History is not a fixed script. It is a living conversation, shaped by who speaks, who listens, and who is left in silence. We've walked through chapters that were never meant to be read. A plot to overthrow democracy, communities burned and buried, children experimented on by the very institutions meant to protect them. We've seen how lies take root not only in what is said, but in what is omitted, how entire truths vanish beneath the steady erosion of official memory. And yet here we are, piecing it back together. The stories we've uncovered are not just about harm. They are about courage, the veterans who refused to betray their country, the citizens who broke into an FBI office to expose injustice, the researchers who stumbled onto forbidden files and chose to speak. Truth doesn't emerge because systems want it to. It surfaces because people, ordinary people, refuse to let it stay buried. And so we are left with a question, both simple and impossible. What else don't we know? What histories lie just beyond reach? Sealed away, misfiled, waiting for the right set of eyes. The mechanisms of suppression haven't disappeared. Classification still shields wrongdoing. Sovereign immunity still protects the powerful. And institutions still often decide which truths are too dangerous to tell. But there is something stronger, our willingness to look anyway, to listen to voices long silenced, to challenge the textbook, to ask who benefits from forgetting. In the end, the stories we choose to tell, and the ones we fight to recover, define not just our past, but our character. This isn't about conspiracy. It's about responsibility. To those who were harmed, to those who were erased, to those who still don't know the full story of the nation they live in. We can't rewrite the past, but we can decide what kind of future grows from it, one built on omission or one rooted in accountability, truth, and memory. The choice is ours. History, after all, is not what happened. It's what we choose to remember. And remembering, truly remembering, is the first act of justice.